Normally, I like to start a speech off with some kind of light-hearted kind of joke or something, but there's nothing funny about what's going on at the minute. There's literally nothing funny about the fact that people are asking you and I to believe that the United States had nothing to do with the blowing up of the Nord Stream, that actually all you needed was a yacht, a swimsuit and a Swiss Army knife, apparently. So I've done it, I've made the joke, haven't I? Because it is actually the way that those countries, the United States and their allies, are trying to get us to do that by going to people like the New York Times, who've got form on this sort of stuff, haven't they? They've got form for the way that they are apologists for the State Department in the US. They go to the New York Times and they go to their hand-picked newspapers in Germany and persuade them to run this nonsense and try to get us all to believe this stuff. Well, one thing's for sure, that in the Morning Star we'll never fall for that nonsense. Number one, actually they'll never ask us to write that nonsense, thankfully. But number two, we'll be the people who will be standing up and saying to people that this is nonsense and that you really ought to look at the facts that people like Seymour Hersh put forward. Real facts and investigative journalists of the highest standards who put out the facts about this and they think that they can just ignore it. There's nothing funny about the fact that across the world, the United States and their mates are pillaging what used to be called the Third World for our resources. Nothing funny in that whatsoever. There's nothing funny at all about the new way that colonialism is enacting itself at the moment. There's nothing funny about any of those things if you're on the receiving end of it. If you're trying to survive day by day, if you're trying to beat starvation, if you're trying to beat poverty, and you see the way that these countries, with their mates, that the US, the UK, and other colonial powers are behaving towards people who are simply just trying to survive, and the reason that they're trying to survive is because of the way that these countries have pillaged our countries over the years. And of course, one of the ways that they enforce their ideology, that they enforce their politics, is at the point of a gun. If they aren't carrying that gun, then what we see now, of course, is the way that they get other people to carry the gun on their behalf, as we're seeing in Ukraine, where they run their proxy wars. But always at the bottom end of all of that is the fact that working class people are dying. And we have to be the ones as socialists who are standing up and saying we're not prepared to put up with this. But more than that, more than just nice words, what we will do is we'll organise. We'll build a movement that's going to make a difference, not just in this country, but we'll build the peace movement internationally as well. And that's why I'm proud to share a platform with all of these folks today, people who've been at the forefront of that fight, at the forefront of the move for peace in this country and internationally. So, in conclusion, I'll just say this. What you will always get from the Morning Star is what we say on our masthead, is that we will be the ones who will be making the case for peace and socialism. We'll always be the newspaper that's doing that, even when it's hard, and even when people tell us that you're wrong, even when people try and say that it's some kind of outmoded thing to want peace and equality and socialism in this world, that we will be the newspaper, always standing up and making the case for socialism.
We recognise this is an incredibly dangerous situation with a very, very serious risk of nuclear war. And that's not just due to the conflict in Ukraine, but also because of the increasing need provocative actions by the US against China. And it's all spelled out in NATO's strategic concept, which it published last year, which does read like NATO is getting ready for World War III. It says it will fight for every inch of Allied territory against nuclear-armed peer competitors to defend the rule-based order, which we've all heard of, which of course is where it's the US that decides the rules and who they apply to, of course. It also makes explicit that Russia and China are its key military targets, the strategic competitors that threaten our values. And it also reiterates NATO's global aggressive expansion, which is all about maintaining US domination, which, has been referred to, has caused so many catastrophic wars, is driving the kind of global economic crisis, and of course is accelerating climate change. So just in terms of this, the current situation in Ukraine, I mean, we've seen, despite serious warnings, by former Russian Prime Minister Medvedev, that pushing Russia into a corner risks it launching a nuclear attack. What has been the US response? To scupper peace talks and escalate the conflict, pressuring NATO states for more lethal weaponry. We had the whole, pressure on Germany to get in those Leopard tanks and to increase their defence spending. Since then, the US is now delivering new satellite-guided nuclear bombs to bases across Europe, including Britain, as part of its strengthening the NATO nuclear presence across Europe. These bombs are being promoted by military experts as the most dangerous nuclear weapons in America's arsenal. And the reason why they're so dangerous, they say, is because they're usable, because they're small, because they're targeted. In reality, nuclear weapons are totally indiscriminate, And these weapons kill hundreds of thousands of people, completely devastate huge swathes of Eastern Europe and potentially Eurasia. These bombs can be launched from the F-35 fighter jets, which are taking part now in military exercises across Eastern Europe. Earlier this month, Dutch fighter jets were involved in military exercises, joint military exercises with Britain in Lakenheath. Those Dutch jets are now stationed in Poland on Ukraine's border. So it's a totally dangerous situation, and it's the US completely escalating this. It risks engulfing Europe in a full-blown war, which could go nuclear. So de-escalation and peace talks are, basically the only way out of this nuclear confrontation. And China's peace plan for Ukraine, I think, is a really important development that we all need to get behind. I think Jenny might be speaking a bit more about this, but obviously, it talks about the opposition to nuclear weapons, it talks about respecting sovereignty, and it talks about a common security approach where all countries' security needs to be taken into consideration to bring about sustainable peace, absolutely essential. But also from C&D's point of view, the halt to NATO expansion is also absolutely central. It's NATO's deeply dangerous and provocative expansion up to Russia's borders that has played an absolutely treacherous role in this conflict. We've all seen the video of Biden in the 90s boasting that the way that you provoke Russia is by expanding up to its borders. So far, the US and Britain have sabotaged peace talks. Why is this? Well, I think this is because the goal isn't for a peaceful settlement. The US Defense Secretary Austin has made it clear, saying that they want to weaken Russia. But the economic impact of the sanctions against Russia has been catastrophic globally, and it's certainly weakening Europe, especially Germany, as its trade links with Russia and Eurasia are being broken. And as Roger referred to, we've seen this most brutally illustrated in the blowing up of the Nord Stream pipeline. basically ending Russian gas supply to Germany. So now Germany must buy from the US expensive, highly dangerous and polluting liquefied natural gas, which is extracted through fracking. And whilst NATO is engaged in what could become an all-out military conflict with Russia, it's also accelerating military confrontation with China. On Monday, Biden, Sunak and Albanese will be announcing the new nuclear submarine program of the AUKUS treaty, which is all about confronting militarily China. So Australia will be spending billions on nuclear-powered submarines, on upgrading US nuclear facilities, while the US is going to be paying, or is paying, for Australia to station long-range US B-52 nuclear bombers in the north of the country. The US is accelerating its military confrontations because it wants to contain China's economic development. China's economy is now larger than the US. Reports indicate that by 2026, this is the International Monetary Fund, say that China's economy will be at least 35% larger than that of the United States. Now, when Lula was elected president of Brazil last year, he said, "We will not accept a new Cold War between the United States and China. We will have relations with everyone." He articulated the global ideal of multipolarity, of mutual, peaceful coexistence advocated by the progressive leaderships across Latin America. And it was a direct challenge to the US project to maintain its global dominance, the attempt to destroy independent economic cooperation and integration, which is at the heart of the multipolar world vision. And it is this project of the US to try desperately to maintain its dominance at the expense of, potentially a nuclear war that threatens us all. Because it's about confronting other nuclear armed states. But as I say, there is hope. I think there is real hope. The overall world situation is shifting away from US dominance. Large sections of the world's population and their leaderships are not lining up with the US and NATO. And the election of victories of progressive, peace-loving leaders like Lula in Latin America is really significant for our cause. And then finally, I think the big mobilisations we're seeing in Europe for peace in Ukraine and an end to the devastating economic impact due to the sanctions on Russia is also an indication that public opinion in countries whose political leaderships are just going along with the US is shifting. So I think what we need to do in Britain, just small tasks for us here. So I think the British left must come together to unite around the broadest demands for peace. We must help bring the Labour movement back on board. So we need to stop the threat of nuclear escalation. We've really got to back Ukraine peace talks now. And while the British government is pushing for increased defence spending of over £5 billion in the middle of the cost of living crisis, our message must be wages, not weapons. We must defeat the Tories' priorities of putting defence spending over people's living standards. And we need to bring the political weight of states in the global south, like Brazil, to bear on our anti-war movement and peace movement here in Britain.
My role here is to look at the Pacific theatre and the dangers of the spillover from the Ukraine crisis, which could escalate into a new world war. US and UK warmongers are constantly trying to convince us that Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, and I quote, raises the spectre of a Chinese takeover of Taiwan. And in this way, the US has also used the Ukraine crisis to increasingly militarize the Asia-Pacific. You know, it already has 400 bases surrounding China, and it's trying to build more. It's got agreements particularly with Japan, and also a new deal with the Philippines, which means that it's got new bases to the north and the south of Taiwan, and so it wants to get itself into a position where it could break an embargo should China choose to impose one around the island. Now, I hasten to add that China seeks peaceful reunification with Taiwan, but has not given up the use of force in the case of outside intervention and interference. The other thing that the United States is doing in the Asia-Pacific region is to reorder and strengthen its regional alliances around AUKUS, together with a revamped US-Japan alliance. So Japan at the moment is undergoing the most radical overhaul in its regional positioning since World War II, elevating itself once again into a military power. It's the only ally to share the US view of China as the main threat. It plans to double its military budget from 1% to 2% in 5 years, overturning its pacifist practice for 70 years. Australia, as Sophie was saying, is to get some nuclear-powered submarines and is also expanding its US bases and increasing its military spending substantially. Meanwhile, agreements on the exchange of armed forces link AUKUS members to Japan, raising the prospect of JAUKUS, in other words, AUKUS plus Japan. And of course, the US is committing more military aid to Taiwan. This is like a dream come true for US warmongers and neocons who, since McCarthyism in the 1950s, have called for the rearming of Japan, with Taiwan to serve as an unsinkable aircraft carrier just 100 miles or so from China's coast. Frankly, I find the xenophobic hysteria sweeping the United States at the moment terrifying. The Biden administration is clearly capable of making wild accusations about the supply of arms to Russia, just as it did over the so-called balloon threat. And as a Chinese military expert wrote in the Financial Times a few days ago, if Beijing takes Moscow's side over Ukraine, we will be at the dawn of World War III. It's particularly important for us in the anti-war movement to understand how the UK is fitting into this. Firstly, the UK signed a military pact with Japan back in January to allow the stationing of British forces on Japanese soil. This actually means that Britain could find itself in direct conflict with China over some disputed islands which lie between Okinawa and Taiwan. These islands, claimed by both China and Japan, could become the battleground in a Taiwan conflict. The UK has also signed a major deal with Japan and Italy, in which BAE Systems and Rolls-Royce, together with Mitsubishi and an Italian company, Leopard, are to build the next generation of fighter jets. These will be capable of carrying hypersonic weapons and would advance Japan's war-fighting capacity significantly, in complete contradiction with its pacifist commitments. The UK is now following the US in linking our future prosperity to arms sales and high-tech arms development through AUKUS, as well as the fighter jet deal. So back to the big picture, Sophie referred to NATO's new security concept, which was agreed last year, which recognises that the security of the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific were closely connected, hence the need to strengthen cooperation between Japan and NATO. So now, with UK help, the US is drawing NATO, AUKUS and Japan together. Not since World War II, when Germany, Italy and Japan forged their axis, have the two war theatres of Europe and Asia been linked. And at this year's summit, this year's NATO summit is set to approve preparations to fight a war on two fronts simultaneously. So this is a scenario for a new world war. However, as speakers before me have emphasised, there are counter developments. With the Ukraine conflict damaging world economic recovery after COVID, the global south is becoming more and more concerned, and a non-aligned impetus can potentially set some limit to the US war drive. Climate change is also a priority, but how to shift from great power rivalry to multipolar cooperation. Just as the situation is threatening to escalate, China has started to challenge the US openly, for example saying that the US is undermining peace in the Ukraine so as to extend conflict for its own benefit. China's 12-point guidelines for Russia-Ukraine discussion sets a framework for peace talks. And with the latest developments, which Andrew referred to, the deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which has just been made in Beijing, shows that we should take Chinese diplomacy very seriously. The Chinese call for an end to Cold War mentality. By that they mean NATO. And they seek to recenter international relations around the UN. Obviously this is not going to happen soon. And meanwhile, our global Britain commitment to a military presence in both Europe and the Indo-Pacific means increasing the military budget. To extend our global military role into the 2060s and beyond. So this makes it not just a matter of more military spending, but actually what kind of a nation do we want to be in the world? What happens in the wider world matters. The non-aligned trend in the global south and also what China is doing is important to our campaigning for how else are we to counter social democracy and the insidious influence of imperialism on our politics.
We've been around as Caribbean Labour Solidarity for about 45 years. We're small, but we carry a punch in the Caribbean. One of our leaders, one of our honorary members, the late Richard Hart, some of you might know, a great communist in the region who was imprisoned in Jamaica at the time of fighting for independence. He was our leader for a long time, and he was also, they went to Grenada after the revolution, and he was there for Minister of Justice and assisting the comrades in the revolutionary struggle, managed to escape just before the Americans invaded. But not before Maurice Bishop, the late Maurice Bishop, who would also we should recognize today and remember, because one of the things that he managed to achieve in the region was to make the Caribbean a zone of peace. And this the OAS agreed to, and also CELAC. This was in 1979. As a result of being able to achieve that, they had some demands. One is no nuclear arms in the region. I think the Americans actually violated it at one point by sending a submarine somewhere in the region. We also called for no military bases, no foreign military bases in the region. And we know that some countries have managed to get rid of foreign bases, Ecuador and I think some others have managed to get rid of military bases. We also called for no military exercises and maneuvers in the region, something we're fighting to maintain. And we also called for decolonization. There's still nearly a dozen countries that are still colonies in the region, and that is something we as Caribbean Labour Solidarity are concerned about. We will continue to fight and challenge and encourage those countries to fight for their independence. We think that's important. We notice in the region that the Americans, I feel like we've got good news in our region because the left is winning at this point, I think, and most countries are going towards the left after generations of American support for dictatorships in the region has left them now as a pariah. Nobody accepts or believes or thinks or supports anything they do in the region. Even CARICOM came out very strongly, which is a grouping of the Caribbean countries, including Haiti and Suriname, have come out strongly to support Venezuela when it appeared as though the Americans wanted to do a military intervention there. And so we think, we're beginning to strengthen a force for peace, not only in the region but in the world. And I think we need more region, more zones of peace throughout the world. Now, we don't have arms. We can't fight the Americans with arms because we see them as the main enemy ready for peace in the region. But we've got moral support, and we campaign, and for us, Caribbean Labour Solidarity, our strength is in joining with other solidarity movements in the region, the Latin America, so we're involved with Nicaragua, Venezuela, all the left groupings, Cuba, for sure, and trade unions. We believe that it's through the trade unions we will start to push the Caribbean against to the left, because since the Grenada Revolution was defeated, the left has not been as strong as it used to be. And we need support in trying to rebuild that. One of the things that we do in the region is to hold a monthly meeting, and we invite the trade unions from the region and other comrades from other parts of the world to fight in that. We say, we also campaign here, of course, because we operate with the diaspora, and one of the things that we campaign along is end the war against big oil, trying to protect the environment, and so we support all the solidarity and progressive movements in the UK. We've had enough war and killing in our region. Some of you may know, from the time Columbus set foot in our region, the indigenous people were almost wiped out, millions killed. Then we endured 300 years of slavery, again, millions killed in that region. Some of you might be aware that Paraguay was the country that actually suffered the most from war. I think something like 80% of the population was decimated in one war that was there in pre-colonial times. And since then, we've also got one of the countries that has been declared one of the most peaceful countries in the world, one of the most happy. I think it's Costa Rica. And the thing that they have is they don't have an army. They got rid of their army. And we say, why do we need to keep supporting armies? And we see what's happening in the United States just recently, declaring, I think, 835 million towards arms spending, in a region or in a country that's got so much poverty. In Britain as well, the same effect, spending billions on arms while people don't have homes and children are actually going to school hungry. So we say, how do we stop this arms trade? How do we, we've got to recognize that the problem facing the world is the arms trade. The Americans depend hugely on having wars. Without the mighty industrial military complex, they will struggle for growth. And they also, at the same time, are destroying the planet. So there's no argument, I think we need to scrap all nuclear arms, and we support that very much. And so we continue to fight in our region. We will do our bit with your support, and we support each other in making sure that there's other zones of peace. We want a peaceful world.
This is a war which is absolutely horrific in all sorts of ways. If you look at what's going on in Bakhmut at the moment, it's monstrous that this is being allowed to continue. It's just the wiping out of a whole town and of huge numbers of people on both sides. It's estimated, and I've no idea how accurate these estimates are, but 200,000 Russian troops so far have died, and something like 100,000 Ukrainians have died in the last year. Now, these are huge figures for modern war in the Western world. I don't want to say everywhere in the world, because we know that 1 million died as a result of the war in Iraq. But if you talk about conventional war of the sort that we've seen in recent years, of the sort we're seeing between Ukraine and Russia, then you're talking about horrific casualties. And the idea that peace is not to be even talked about, that if you discuss peace or raise peace, that somehow you're repeating a Putin talking point or you're doing any of these things, is a very, very it's an obscene aspect of British politics at the moment, and let's face it, there's plenty of obscene aspects of British politics, not least this small boats policy, and you know, perhaps we should all, as we said earlier, pay tribute to Gary Lineker and all the other football pundits who aren't going to be working for the BBC today. And it's shameful what is going on, but it's not new, any of this. It's not new the way that they cover the war. The only difference is, when we invaded Afghanistan, when we invaded Iraq, when we bombed Libya, we never had British journalists embedded in those countries telling you how the Afghans and the Iraqis and the Libyans were being treated. We never saw the consequences of the war. Now we see it every day, and it's horrific, and nobody wants to have that war going on. But we need to also be clear where it comes from. It comes not just from the Russian invasion, which Stop the War condemned at the very beginning and continue to do so, but it comes from a system that we live under, where there is a drive to war, which is getting more and more acute and more serious. And I want to just go back a little bit to where, I mean, we can talk about this in terms of the First World War and the Second World War and so on, but if you think in recent times, this really, the build-up of arms and the increased spending on arms particularly accelerated round and after the First Gulf War in 1990-1991, where the US was in conflict with Iraq, with Saddam Hussein's Iraq. We had the beginning of the build-up there. We had the first, Ukraine is talked about as the first war in Europe since 1945. That isn't true. The first war in Europe in 1945 were the Balkans Wars, a whole series of them, culminating in the NATO bombing of Serbia, which Bob referred to at the beginning of this session. Since 9/11, when the War on Terror was launched, we've had the doubling of arms production and militarism worldwide. It's simply been a huge increase, and we think of it obviously quite rightly in terms of the US imperialism, which is by far the biggest arms builder, arms seller, all the different kinds of things, the biggest military in the world, a huge military in the world. But this is true now of many, many countries. It's true if you look, for example, at Saudi Arabia, doubled its weapons spending over the last 20 years. It's true of countries that at the moment are saying, quite rightly, that there should be peace. China has a huge military, which is growing, because the way in which the world operates is if you see that you're under threat, then you're going to see more and more money spent on arms. Brazil has huge arms, which until recently were in the control of the far-right government of Bolsonaro. So India has huge arms. This is not just a Western problem, if you like. It is a problem which is leading us towards the possibility of war between, not just between two countries in Europe, but between whole parts of the world. And you know, Jenny has spelled out in great detail about what's happening in the Pacific and all of these kind of things. It seems to me that we are heading, when the title of this is, you know, can we stop World War III? We're heading towards a situation where a Third World War becomes not just something we talk about as a distant prospect, but a real prospect. And Andrew Murray made the point that when there was the war against Afghanistan, Afghanistan didn't even have an air force. Everybody knew America was going to win, and win quickly. Actually, it didn't win after 20 years, but they knew that they could overthrow the Taliban government. Everybody knew when the US and Britain invaded Iraq, that eventually the Iraqi government would be defeated, would be overthrown, and that was the aim of the operation. If you look now, you're talking about conflicts already between nuclear-armed powers, and the prospect of those conflicts becoming much, much greater. So it seems to me this is a very, very serious point in our history, and one that we have to take very seriously. And the question about how we organise, I think, is absolutely crucial. Just two things it's worth saying here. The media is playing the most atrocious role in this war, even worse. I mean, those of us my age and similar age, we remember the Vietnam War, we remember all the wars since then, and how the media always sided with US imperialism. Now, you don't even hear a dissenting voice about anything at all. And that's the media. That's not just the right-wing media. That's all of the media. And the correspondents and the journalists who've spoken out against war. Look at how they're now treated. Look at John Pilger, who was the foreign editor of the Daily Mirror, who's a very respected journalist, treated as a cranky conspiracy theorist. Peter Oborne, who is a Tory, is in every bone of his body. The guy is a Tory, except he's honest enough to tell the truth about the British government on a whole number of different levels. A pariah now in the mainstream media. He's not given a column in any of the mainstream papers like he used to have, and you could go on and on and on. So that's a serious problem. The other serious problem is the role of the left in this country. I use this in the broadest sense. There are many people on the left, including the people in the room here and many other people who have played a very, very good and honourable role in terms of mobilising against war. But I have to say, with the MPs in Parliament who took their name off the Stop the War statement a year ago, in doing so, they very, very much weakened the anti-war movements. That's the truth of what happened. We now find it harder to book rooms. We've just had a room that we've got for a meeting on Iraq cancelled just down the road from here because they've been getting messages from, I don't know from who, but saying that they're going to be picketed and there'll be violence against them and all this sort of thing. It's much harder to defend yourself in these circumstances when you don't have a single Labour MP that will come on your platform, when you don't have any of these things going. And to me, this is a big question, and it's a question which makes it harder for councillors to speak out, makes it harder for Labour Party members to speak out, and it means that we have to look at how we're going to organise in that kind of way. The truth is that at the moment it is quite hard to mobilise large numbers of people against this war. I don't think that means people are enthusiastic for the war. I don't see any sign of that, to tell the truth, apart from government figures. But people accept this argument and there is an alternative narrative being put on a wide enough scale. That's what we've got to try and change. And what we're doing in Stop the War, we're having regional demonstrations and rallies that we're going to organise over the next few months. We had the demonstration last couple of weeks ago on the anniversary of the war, and we're going to do much, much more trade union work to try to reverse this iniquitous policy that was passed at the TUC last year of increasing defence spending. This is at a time, as has been said, when there is no money for any public services, but there's money to go to war. Last year, in Britain alone, 2.3 billion was given to Ukraine for weapons and other forms of aid. They are matching it this year, 2.3 billion. By coincidence, the 40 hospitals that they said they were going to build or to repair or whatever it was in Boris Johnson's fevered mind at the time, they're now saying because of inflation they can't afford to provide, guess what, £2 billion to build those hospitals or to rebuild those hospitals. These are the choices they're facing us with, and to me this is a class question as much as anything else. Working class people are expected to die in war, and those of us who don't die in the wars are expected to pay for the wars. That's what they're telling us to do. We have to say we're not going to put up with it, and we have to link it to all the different struggles that are going on. I'm very heartened about the strikes that are going on. But I also know that what this government is doing, they're using the boats and the scapegoating of refugees to try to drive a wedge among working class people, to try to weaken working class organisation and working class strength. And therefore, our fight has to be not just in favour of a decent pay rise and decent cost of living increases for people, it also has to be against racism and against war. And we have to bring all these issues together.